When you look at Abu ala Maududi's, Israr Ahmad, Sayyid Qutub's, Hassan Banna, Taqiyuddin Ibhani's, a lot of them, they're not clerics per se. They're professors, they're journalists, they're coming from very modern academic background, plus they understand Islam.
So in Iran, we had this great figure who's, I think, a parallel figure to Sayyid Qutb and
Ali Shariati.
Maulana Maududi. Ali Shariati. He was a university professor.
Yeah.
And basically is in that same mold of intellectuals who reinterpret Islam to deal with the contemporary realities afflicting Muslims. The problem of imperialism, colonialism, the question of Palestine. I don't think, as Muslims who have an ethical conscience and awareness, that we should be forced to pick and choose, that it's either the United States and Europe or it's China or Russia. Take your pick. No, I think we need to stand for an alternative way. An alternative way that's fundamentally rooted in Islamic ethics, that has basic rights and opportunities for everyone around the world.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and welcome to Islamic OASIS Live. As always, brothers and sisters, we try to bring you unique voices, professors, scholars, journalists from around the world, those who are in the know-how, people who understand the situation that's taking place in the world, whether it's political, intellectual, or otherwise. We had many different, authors, let's say, people who were writing on Iran, people who discussed Iran from day one, and to be honest, even since 1979, and what's happening in Iran and where Iran might go. Today, we have a special guest, Professor Georgetown, Nader Hashemi. MashaAllah, I'm sure many of you have seen him on many different shows and also different news networks, CNN, NPR, Al Jazeera. He's written many books. I was just going over the different books in the voluminous work that the professor has done. It's almost impossible to go through all of that because of the time, but please do check him out. He has, subhanAllah, a lot of amazing writing on almost subjects as far as Islam and human rights. He's written for also in Wall Street Journal, The Nation, for Jazeera, as I mentioned earlier, on democracy, on the Middle East in general, and also the political theory initiatives in general, in many intellectual works. But today we are going to discuss with him Iran, and he is also from Iran, and with all this background makes him a very unique voice in trying to understand what's taking place in Iran. So, Dr. Hashim, welcome to Islamic OASIS.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for the invitation. I look forward to our conversation.
So, Professor, what is taking place? I mean, in your understanding, obviously you've written a lot on Iran. You've since the revolution, 1979, maybe pre-revolution, the West has played a very unique role in this region of the world. Constantly has maybe even a role of an agitator in many ways in trying to look at its interest depending on who's in power and things like this, especially in this whole region, whether it's Pakistan or Iran. But Iran has been going through this since 1960s, 1950s, to be honest. So what's happening, Sheikh? If you can kind of give us a broader view of what's happening, and then we can go into the nitty-gritty, I guess.
Sure. Well, I think one has to understand the modern history of Iran as part and parcel of a broader story that is common to large parts of the Islamic world, the Middle East, the global South. And what I mean by that is because of the geographical location of Iran in West Asia, or what we call today the Middle East, Iran's modern history was deeply shaped by the intervention of European imperial forces, primarily the British and the Russians, and then later on, after World War II, the Americans. And so the story of Iran in grand historical perspective is not that different from the story of many countries in the global south whose political independence, development potential, and modern identity was deeply shaped by the intervention of external forces, great powers. Now, when you zero in your analytical lens on each of these countries, the story has its own specific, details and nuances and contours. But that's the broad sort of, historical picture that I think unites Iran with large parts of the Islamic world, the global south, which is why large parts of the Islamic world and the global south have rallied and expressed deep sympathy to Iran at this moment as it comes under an American-Israeli assault, because this attack is not happening in a vacuum. There is a back and deeper story to this. And in terms of Iran's story, its modern identity was shaped by the powers that I just mentioned, and it was largely a result of that external intervention that we had a revolution in 1979. So the critical, I think, factors that matter for contemporary politics in terms of understanding Iran is that Iran has had a long struggle for independence, for democracy, that was repeatedly subjugated and affected by external intervention. In 1906, Iran was one of the first countries to have a constitutional revolution that was generated and motivated by a response to the internal corruption and decadence and despotism of the ruling monarchy. The Qajar monarchy was just, monumentally corrupt, had no interest in human development or in, national independence. It simply wanted to survive and was willing to cut deals with foreign powers. And there was an uprising that produced this constitutional revolution, for which the question of religion and politics was an important part of Iran's constitutional experiment, because anytime there's a political opening and, Muslims, wherever they are, they come together, the issue that naturally is put on the agenda is, well, what should the relationship between religion and politics be? And this was part of the debate, and the clerical community was divided over the constitutional revolution. Some supported it, some didn't support it. Political tracts were published justifying the idea of constitutionalism from an Islamic perspective. There were counter treaties and narratives and books published that opposed the idea. Anyways, that constitutional revolution, long story short, which lasted from 1906 to 1911, effectively ended because the British and the Russians collaborated to crush that democratic opening. And there's one moment that illustrates this, when Russia sends its tanks into Tehran, surrounds the parliament building where the parliamentarians were meeting, and bombards it, forcing the parliamentarians to flee under bombardment, restoring the monarchy in 1911 after a tumultuous back and forth period. So that was a key moment in Iran's modern history. Iran effectively becomes divided by a Russian zone of influence in the north and a British zone of influence in the south for much of the early part of the 20th century, until World War II arrives. And at the time, Iran was ruled by a new monarchy, the Pahlavi monarchy, that was established in 1925. And it was an authoritarian, modernizing monarchy that was very similar to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in neighboring Turkey. In other words, the monarch was very secular, very authoritarian, very anti-clerical and anti-religious, and ruled Iran with a heavy hand. And he was a nationalist. He was independent. So the comparison with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk sort of, I think, applies here. He wasn't as radically secular and westernizing as Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who in fact did change the language and deeply repressed religion and tried to sort of turn Turkey into a European country. But he was, in that mold. He was deposed in 1941 for reasons that tell you something about modern Iranian politics and history. In 1941, it's the beginning of World War II, and the Allied powers wanted to have a land route to support Russia in its war with Germany, and so they effectively just rolled in tanks. The British did, and marched up to Tehran, put the existing king, a man by the name of Reza Pahlavi, on a boat and sent him to an island off of the African coast called Mauritius, and he died in exile there. And put in his place his 21-year-old son, who was known by the name of Mohammad Reza. Spent most of his life in a Swiss boarding school, but he basically became the new leader of Iran, the king of Iran, as a result of that military intervention. But what happened in the 1940s after that political change is that this was the moment of decolonization in the global South. People were struggling for independence and autonomy, and rejecting the role of foreign powers in shaping the economic and political destiny of their countries. This moment manifests itself in Iran in the context of a nationalist movement, where the biggest issue on the agenda for Iranian nationalists was the question of Iran's oil industry. Iran's oil industry was established by British Petroleum. They were reaping all the profits. They were treating their workers horrifically. And the nationalist forces that come to power, because the monarchy was very weak at the time, parliament is allowed to function again, external powers are occupied by what's happening in Europe. They don't really care about what's happening in Iran. This allows for civil society to emerge. And, you have nationalist forces that get elected, and they say, look, we are deeply offended that the natural resources that lie under our feet are controlled by a foreign power. We want to renegotiate the deal over the oil industry. And this produces a global crisis for Iran and its relationship with Britain. Long story short, Britain refuses to compromise over renegotiating the terms of Iran's oil industry. And they put a blockade on Iran. And they initiate a plot that the Americans eventually sign on to topple the existing nationalist prime minister, a man by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh, who's both an Iranian nationalist, but also a pious and practicing Muslim at the same time. And the CIA and the British MI6 effectively, claiming that Iran was going to turn communist. This was the early days of the Cold War. We have to get rid of this guy. They depose him. And the documentation on this is all public now. And they replace the prime minister with the Shah, the king of Iran, who had fled the country during this period of upheaval. And they back him with full support. And he presides over a deeply authoritarian political system with American support, European support. The Shah of Iran, crushes all opposition. He's basically the United States, America's man in the Middle East. People forget this, but the biggest American presence in the Middle East, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and throughout most of the 1970s, was in Iran. The Shah was, America's most loyal ally in the region, even to a greater extent, one could argue, than Israel. And because the Shah was brutal, because he was corrupt, because he was put back on the throne by the Americans, and because he was non-representative, he suffered from a crisis of legitimacy. And it's during the post-1953 coup era where nationalist and religious opposition begins to build in Iran, opposing the Shah as he becomes more repressive, as he becomes more, closely tied to American interests. And this is where you have the forces of religion reinventing themselves, organizing themselves, and starting to engage in political critique and analysis from the prism of what they would understand to be an Islamic ethical obligation to confront tyranny, despotism, injustice. And they start to speak out. And they, of course, are repressed. The leader of this movement, of course, was the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the leader of the revolution in 1979. He is exiled into Iraq. And he returns back to power in the moment of a revolutionary upheaval, where a revolution breaks out in Iran in late 1978, and it's a revolution that could be understood and should be understood as one of the great and most consequential revolutions of the 20th century, on the same level in terms of its importance and geopolitical and global impact as the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, the Cuban Revolution in the late 1950s. And so a longstanding American ally was toppled, and Islamic revolutionaries come to power, consolidate power. They had broad public support at the time, and they establish what they call an Islamic Republic, and they seek to rule Iran based on this new vision where Islam and politics are united. I get my students, when I teach this topic, to read the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran to get a sense of how this idea of a republic was melded with an idea of Islam. And of course, it's based on the theses, the political theory of Ayatollah Khomeini, who reinterpreted Shia political Islam to make the argument that the best form of government would be one where it's an Islamic government, but where religious clerics would have a particularly important and unique role in guiding the political system. Public input was there, but there was a unique role designated for the role of religious clerics, and not just any religious clerics, religious clerics.
I guess that's...
Yes, that concept, which is a unique interpretation of Shia Islam that Ayatollah Khomeini came up with. And it's, if you read it, and I teach my students this in my course, I teach a regular course called Modern Islamic Political Thought that begins with Jamaluddin al-Afghani and ends with bin Laden, and we go through all the major thinkers. And when we get to Ayatollah Khomeini, I get my students to read sections from his book called Islamic Government, which were based on a series of lectures that he gave when he was in exile in Najaf, where he lays out an argument.
But this is a book.
Why? Yeah. The book is called The Islamic Government. It's been translated into English by Hamid Algar, who is a prominent scholar at Berkeley. I think he's retired now. And it's a book that is the foundational theses of the Islamic Republic of Iran, based on these lectures that Ayatollah Khomeini gave, where he makes an argument for Islamic government.
Sheikh, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm going to start with the role of the clerics in the region.
Right.
It seems, I was reading, there's a lot of books written also on the clerics. They have played a very unique role in Iran from a very long time, good 100 years, that's it. They've given a lot of sacrifices also, which is a bit different than what the clerics that we see today in the Sunni world. From the Qataris, the Saudis, and most of them are very, we say ulama salatin, let's say, those who are constantly just kissing the hands of these kings and dictatorships and whatever. Why is that, Sheikh? What is that? Why that type of intellectual decline when it comes to Sunni Islam, especially from the clerical side, versus the revolutionary activism that you see in that region, in Iran especially?
That's a great question. Now, Iran, throughout its modern history, had these types of court clerics that you just described. So during the reign of the Shah, they were there. All throughout the Muslim world. Throughout any society where religion is a factor in popular identity, there's always these compliant religious authorities who are basically, who rubber stamp the policies of existing authoritarians. So Iran had that tradition. But it also had a tradition of oppositional dissident clerics who refused to bow down to political power, and who, in the course of the modern period, reinterpreted Islam to respond to questions of social, economic, and political injustice, and laid out a narrative, a worldview, a critique. I think the case in Iran and in Iraq to a certain extent is different because of economic reasons. In other words, within the structure of Shia Islam, there is independent sources of funding that Shia Muslims are obligated to pay as part of their religious duties that go to a cleric or religious leader that they follow. This gives some clerics a certain independence and source of income, so they're not dependent on the state. And I think that one factor, possibly, according to the theories that explain, because this is the question that you're asking, is actually a great question.
I mean,
why did a revolution?
One of the things. No, please come to that. I just want to add a little bit to that. It seems
sure.
When you look at, within the Sunni world, I guess when you look at Abu al-Maududis, Israr Ahmad's, you see Sayyid Qutb's, Hassan Banna, Taqiyuddin Ibhani's, and there are many more, of course. A lot of them, like Sayyid Qutb, let's say, or Abu al-Maududi and Israr Ahmad, who we continuously hear their names, they're not clerics per se.
Right.
They're professors, they're journalists, they're coming from a very modern academic background, plus they understand Islam. Did that also, I mean, if you can kind of address that also within the education of the clerics in Iran versus...
So in Iran, we had this great figure who I still teach, who's I think a parallel figure to Sayyid Qutb and Maulana Maududi, Ali Shariati, who was a lay, he was a university professor, and basically is in that same mold of independent, deeply Islamically engaged intellectuals who reinterpret Islam to deal with the contemporary realities afflicting Muslims, which is the problem of imperialism, colonialism, the question of Palestine, the question of what does it mean to be a pious and practicing Muslim in the modern age? How do we respond to the challenge of secular modernity? So Iran had those types of intellectuals, but they also had a group of clerics who were dissident clerics who broke with the established clerical community. So Iran, like other Muslim countries, had their court clerics, or it's also accurate to say they had their apolitical clerics. So during the time of Ayatollah Khomeini, the most supreme religious clerical leader in Iran was an Ayatollah by the name of Ayatollah Burujerdi. And he was, supported by the Shah of Iran. He was apolitical. He did not comment on questions of politics, of foreign policy. There's an entire theology, as some of your listeners will know. I think it's a fundamentally un-Islamic theology that believers should not engage in political critique, especially directed at political leadership, because then that will lead to chaos, to tyranny, to violence. It's the job of a believer to simply focus on the rituals, on the ibadat, and not focus on, questions of politics. That is not our realm. And, we just have to wait for, Allah to come and change the world. Or if we don't get justice in this world, then in the next life, then we will get justice. That's a dominant view that unfortunately has been deliberately promoted and encouraged in this modern period by these authoritarian regimes that rule over the Islamic world. And it's precisely because of that interpretation where we have gross injustices that take place in front of our eyes, and the leading clerical communities and leaders don't say very much. And I'm talking about, just to cite one example, the genocide in Gaza. Where are these?
You see the Sufi Salafi type of,
interpretation that promote this type of sort of engagement, and some Muslims follow it. I think it's fundamentally unsustainable Islamic ethically. I don't think that's the legacy or the understanding or the interpretation of Islam that I understand from the Prophet, the Seerah of the Prophet when I read it, or even the previous prophets, in terms of how we should understand our religious obligations and our responsibility to the world in which we live in. But that is a dominant interpretation. And unfortunately, you go to many mosques today, even here in North America, and I go to many of them every time I travel to a different city. the Jummah khutbahs that I often hear are often very disconnected to the contemporary world that we're living in, that are defined and shaped by the policies of Donald Trump and these authoritarian leaders around the world.
So tell me, Sheikh, this is very interesting because you also mentioned Global South. Sheikh, what role did the education of the Global South play in this? Like you read studies of theory of violence, you read the pedagogy of there's different, Fanon writes on these, and just talking about, how education itself has played a role of dumbing down, huge regions of the world. So is it that, when you go to a mosque in a place like North America, where everything and anything you want is available to you, you just have to seek it, education, internet, whatever it is that you're looking for, which is not available in a lot of other places, which is constantly monitored and things like this. Even in this environment, you are ignorant in many ways, and you want the public that you speak to every week, sometimes 1,500 people, to also be same way.
Yeah.
Why? What is that, Sheikh? Is that the education of the cleric now? What?
Well, look, that's a great question, and it's a very serious problem, because unless we can make Islam relevant to our lives, speaking to the immense amount of injustice that we see around us, it's not going to stand the test of time. I mean, let me just speak personally. I remember when I was growing up, I went to school in Canada. I remember going to Jummah khutbah after Jummah khutbah, where the sermon that was given had nothing to do with the contemporary political, social, economic world that we were living in Canada, or what was happening in the Islamic world. The khutbahs were all about how we can perfect the practice of rituals and think about the next life. But there was very little engagement with contemporary issues of socioeconomic and political injustice. That comes out of, I think, a particular school of thought within Islamic seminaries and Islamic schools that, some people define as a Salafi interpretation of Islam that's informed by Saudi Arabia and its brand of Islam and its politics, that wants to sort of use Islam as a way of maintaining social control, not disrupting or challenging existing political power. And so if you go to many of these seminaries, whether it's in Al-Azhar or whether it's in Medina or whether it's in, one can also argue in the Islamic
South
Republic
Africa,
of Iran.
India.
Yeah, South Africa. It's very much an interpretation of Islam that is existing in a way that's disconnected from the contemporary world that we're living in terms of questions of injustice and poverty and imperialism and colonialism. Just as when I was growing up, I was a young man. I was trying to understand, my place in this world. I remember following this man who perhaps you've heard of. He was fairly well known. This is before the internet, but his videos were everywhere. And he was a South African, scholar of Islam by the name of Ahmad Deedat.
Yeah, of course.
And
my wife studied under him.
You studied under him.
My wife.
So Ahmad Deedat was not. Ahmad Deedat was South African, and he was very good in engaging in these polemical debates with other Christian scholars, right? But he had nothing to say about the problem of apartheid in South Africa. And in fact, if you study the Muslim community in South Africa, there was a small minority of Muslims who broke away from the mainstream interpretation of Islam that was taught in many of the mosques in South Africa, who said, look, this question of apartheid, of racism, of poverty, that's not our issue. That we shouldn't get involved in these. Our issue as Muslims should be much more narrow. We focus on ibadat, we focus on prayer, we focus on sort of the very basics. Leave these questions of politics aside. Now, thankfully, a group of this history has now been written by a lot of Muslim activists and scholars who come out of that experience. They said, no, absolutely not. How can you be an ethical Muslim? How can you live up to your ethical obligations as a Muslim in South Africa unless you have an opinion over the question of apartheid that the world was talking about, right? It mobilized the world. But for many Muslims in South Africa at the time, there was no engagement, no critique, no organizing, no coalition building. It was just focusing narrowly on an interpretation of Islam that was effectively disconnected from the real world in which many Muslims were living. That problem that I'm just describing can be extended to communities around the world, where in many of these mosques that you go to, when you hear the imam speak or you hear the Jummah khutbah, it very often is on topics that are not connected to the problems of our real world that are not just affecting Muslims, but affecting the whole planet, from climate change to authoritarianism to genocide to poverty to, a mosque was shot up in San Diego a couple of weeks ago by these two young kids informed by this Islamophobic discourse. How many imams spoke about that in mosques in the United States and sort of said, look, it could be your mosque next unless we organize and we figure out what's going on and we, get involved in, so this problem is a very real problem. In fact, it got to a point, I remember, in the small circle of, Muslim activists that I was a part of in Ottawa at the time, where, what we were seeing in the mosques were so alienating and so dispiriting that, a debate emerged that maybe we should just not go to the mainstream Jummah prayer that was happening, because it was in fact undermining our iman. It was depleting us because we saw something that just didn't speak to our ethical obligations as Muslims. Maybe we should have an alternative Jummah prayer, go to a different mosque. And so that's not just my experience when I compare notes with other Muslims. Even today, it's very rare when one goes to a mosque where one is really inspired by the, khatib or by the leader, where they give a compelling sermon or speech that's both solidly Islamic, but applied to the issues of socioeconomic injustice and poverty and, genocide and, humiliation that Muslims, and then we're talking about Iran here, okay, another Muslim country is attacked,
Sheikh, two
so
things.
there's a lot to talk about.
There is, and that's, I want to come back to it, but it seems like we're going to have more conversations. Your time is limited with me here, so I really got to take it. The thing, Sheikh, so two things. One, if you can address, a lot of the masajid actually didn't even talk about Iran. Even Iran was happening. It's been now 3-4 months. Still, we don't know if the war will begin again. And there's a lot going on. But the Jummah khutbahs, or even in general, sure. But a lot of mosques are not even talking about Gaza, Sheikh. And so if you can address that, when it comes to why not talk about Iran, just kind of brush it off saying it's Shia, it's Shia, it's Shia. And then the issue of Gaza, now it's getting to a point where it's getting really deeply political. We might anger a certain crowd in the government, and that could take away our 501(c)(3)s. We could be undermined. There's a lot of that. And the second issue is that when it comes to college campuses, which you are on, like Georgetown and others, we actually saw that student bodies were taking it more seriously, who are not from any of these madaris. They're not from the madaris, they're not from the seminaries, they're not from the mosque. Heck, they're not even Muslim. They were the one addressing Gaza and maybe even addressing Iran more than the Muslims themselves addressing these issues. Go ahead.
Absolutely agree. I think those students who led the Gaza encampment movements in 2024, that mobilized the world, that inspired the world, were actually, those students were upholding an Islamic ethical obligation to stand up against injustice and to fight and to sacrifice. Even though the people who organized it were not coming out of an Islamic tradition. Actually, many of the students were of Muslim background, but the people who were organizing those protests just to cite one example, to sort of sharpen your point, we have this thing called the Gaza Samud Flotilla.
Yeah, of course.
Where these international activists sacrifice their time and energy, and they sail boats from different European ports with aid. And they say, we are going to Gaza and we're going to break the Israeli blockade if we can. And we're going to shine a global spotlight on this genocide. And we're not going to be intimidated or stopped. Muslims should be doing that.
Yeah,
Muslims should be organizing this. And of course, what's so tragic is, well, number one, you have a lot of Muslims in the world, right? Roughly 25% of the global population now is Muslim. You have a lot of very affluent Muslim countries, and they're doing none of this. In fact, I would argue the leadership of many of the Muslim countries are actually complicit in the genocide in Gaza, by virtue of their alliance with Israel and their relationship with the United States. And they
protect Israel.
They protect Israel, and they silence people within their own countries who try and protest. So all of these acts of global solidarity, whether it's the Gaza Samud Flotilla or these student activists, they are actually the ones, in my view, who are upholding and living up to the Islamic ethical tradition of standing up for truth, for justice, for the victims of in this case, genocide. It's not coming out of the seminaries.
Why is that in the intellectual realm? Let's say, in the academia. Why is that happening in the universities? Is it, and that's not happening there? Is it a certain curriculum? Is it more awareness? They're just intellectually more there. What is it, Professor?
So just to be sure, your question is, why are the university students leading these types of
They're not
organized...
only leading, but it's obviously there is something that they're learning. There's certain type of awareness, obviously, that exists. There's something that's compelling them to sacrifice at the level that they are sacrificing. People are, even professors, they let go of their positions and things like this. Yeah. We didn't see any of it from the seminaries.
Agree. Absolutely agree. And this is a dark spot on the seminaries, on the Islamic school, on Islamic leadership everywhere for not leading this campaign. I think the answer to your question is very simply, universities in North America and the United States, at least before Trump got into power, were open, intellectual spaces where people can organize and debate without anyone coming and trying to stop them. So you had that free environment where you can organize and mobilize on any issue you want. You have young people who are very idealistic. They believe in a better world. They're more aware of what's happening in the world. And what was so noteworthy about the students who led these Gaza protests is they were taking a position on Gaza and on the US government's policy on Gaza that directly conflicted the official state narrative and what the mainstream media was saying about the genocide in Gaza. And they were doing it because they were informed by what they were seeing on their social media accounts. In other words, they were able to develop an education and an awareness and an understanding of what's happening in Gaza that challenged the dominant narrative of state and the legacy media. And they were able to mobilize around this, because this young generation that I teach at universities, I think they are much better aware of questions of historical injustice. What happened to the indigenous population of North America? There's a deep sympathy and understanding. What happened to the legacy of slavery and the descendants of slaves? There's a deep sense of understanding, a deeper understanding of the questions of colonialism and imperialism and the role that the West has historically played. And then when Gaza happens, because the American position and the government of all Western governments was effectively to side with Israel and to send more aid to Israel and to blame everything on the Palestinians, that was, I think, a position that young people could not tolerate. They were seeing what was happening on the on their iPhones and smartphones. They were seeing the role that their government was playing. I think what's unique about these issues is the question of positionality. And what I mean by that, if you are an American citizen where your tax dollars are going to send weapons to a state that's committing genocide against children, you have a unique responsibility to speak out. I mean, if you're a Muslim living in, let's say, South Africa, or if you're a Muslim living in, let's say, Malaysia, well, your government is not responsible for committing genocide. But if you're living in the United States of America, where both political parties and every single one, the vast majority of those weapons that have destroyed Gaza are American-made weapons, then you have a unique responsibility to organize and speak out against those injustices. And so I think the young kids that produced this, Gaza encampment movement were driven by this sense of an understanding of historical injustice. They saw the hypocrisy of the West when it came to Russia and Ukraine, where all of a sudden international law and war crimes and opposing aggression and annexation became the narrative call and the position of all these Western governments. But when it came to Gaza, it was the exact opposite. We don't believe in war crimes. We're not going to hold anyone accountable. The International Criminal Court doesn't matter. When the International Court of Justice said Israel was plausibly committing genocide, one Western government after the next said, we're not going to believe, we don't care about international law. We don't accept the court's rulings. And some young people, in many ways, driven by the gross hypocrisy and double standard that they were seeing from their elected leaders, said enough is enough. We are not going to stay silent. And they sacrificed. And let's not undermine the courage and the humanity. And I would argue the embodiment of Islamic ethics that these young kids demonstrated. Many of them were kicked out of university, lost their scholarships, were punished and penalized. Their names were put on blacklists so they couldn't get hired by law firms and medical schools. But they did the right thing at a critical moment, and they kept the spotlight on Gaza when everyone wanted to forget it. And of course, the other part of this story that hasn't gotten enough attention is, what has the Islamic world done? What has the leaders of the Muslim world done in response to this genocide in Gaza? And the answer is very little.
Well,
a lot of conferences, a lot of talk, very little substance.
But they're colonies. So what else
they're colonies, because people don't have. That's what they don't have. Yeah, that's what they expect, and they know that if they said anything or did anything on Gaza, that their foreign aid, their support, the arms, and the intelligence, cooperation that they have with the West would quickly end. So, but there's a lot that I think can be said and should be said about, what Muslims could be doing. Should be doing. I think, it depends on where you live. I don't think the moral responsibility of a Muslim in Malaysia toward the genocide in Gaza is the same as the moral respancy of an American Muslim living in the United States who still have the right to vote. It's one thing that you
can speak out, but, look, if the United States can send armies to protect tyrants, the Muslim countries should be looking at what they need to do with their armies to protect, people from being genocided. That's a discussion we can have. They're sitting there watching as Muslims. If you're expecting students who are aware to just take a stand and even sacrifice, how about all of these armies that are sitting there watching? Next door neighbor, Egypt. Forget about Malaysia. Forget about Indonesia.
I agree.
You look at Egypt, who's watching.
No, it's not just watching, but let's not forget Egypt shares a border with Gaza.
Yeah.
There's a genocide happening on the other side of the border. People are starving. Why couldn't Egypt, break that border and say, look, United States, Israel, we cannot allow a genocide to happen on our doorstep. Either you stop the genocide or we're going to break down that border and we're going to feed the starving people on the other side. None of that, of course, was on the offering because General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is a military stooge backed by the United States and Israel and the West, who first and foremost, like most Muslim rulers, cares about his political throne.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
He doesn't care about Islamic ethics.
Well, he was placed in there for that. Sheikh, the other thing, there's critique of Iran also, right? There's just like any of these other, cartoonic states that we see, but Iran can the Sunni world say that, look, when Afghanistan situation happened during, let's say, the first Taliban government that was there, Iran actually played a very active role in the north of Afghanistan to support US to get rid of Taliban. The role that Iran played in Syria, in when people were trying to rise up against, someone like Bashar al-Assad, also in Iraq, in many ways siding with the Americans to come in and did what they did to Iraq, destroyed Iraq in every possible way. I mean, is that a reason for why maybe the lack of support? Because when I speak to Syrians, and we've had many Syrian scholars up here and others, and they say, look, man, we lost 1 million people. If you don't believe million, at least 500,000 are there. I've seen, I was there throughout Iran, Syrian revolution, and I saw the whole revolution very closely. And is that not a fair critique of the government's role in many American ambitions?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fair critique. One of the challenges of being a Muslim, an ethical Muslim, is being morally consistent and applying the same moral standard and critique on all governments. So what Iran did in Syria, as you've just alluded to, I think is morally indefensible. Iran is directly complicit in the 500,000 lives that were lost from 2011 to, at least 2019, when the war was in full swing. I don't think we should give Iran a free pass just because they're being attacked by the United States and Israel. I think we need to hold all of these countries to the same standard. And of course, like all political dynasties or regimes in Iran being one of them, the rulers of Iran make policies based on their perceived national interests, and they justified that supporting Bashar al-Assad was in their national interests. What that effectively translated into was a moral disaster for the people of Syria. So, Iran is not innocent in the politics of the Middle East. It has a lot it has to be held accountable for. I think the fundamental problem in all of these countries, the one theme that ties them together, is because all of these countries in the Muslim world, including Iran, are the people don't have a voice. They don't have. There's no accountable policies and procedures where elected officials or officials who are in power, elected or not, can are forced to answer for their policies. They get away with mass murder, and anyone who raises a question or a critique gets silenced, imprisoned, tortured, or is forced to flee into exile. So I think we need to evaluate Iran's policies both domestically, in terms of how it rules its own population, which is a very ugly story, and its regional policies, whether it's in Iraq or critically in Syria. I think you're absolutely right, actually, to point to Syria, because if you look at the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Syria is a unique moment where Iran directly participated and perpetuated, mass murder that allowed the House of Assad to perpetuate itself and undermine the potential of political change that existed in Syria in the early days of that revolution, and led to the chaos and the mayhem. So I think you're absolutely right. I don't think anyone who engages in apologetics, my view is, look, if you're a Muslim, you should not engage in double standards. If we're going to criticize the generals in Egypt for what they are doing to their own population and what they are not doing with respect to Gaza and the genocide, we have to hold all countries and all leaders, Iran included, for their own policies of repression and for regional chaos that have led to the loss of a lot of lives. When we start engaging in these types of apologetics, then you lose me as a Muslim. There's that great one of my favorite surahs in the Quran is that that ayah, and I believe it's in chapter 4, where God commands the believers to stand up for justice, even if it's against your own family, your own community, and your own tribe. And you read that verse, It's an argument for the universal application of justice. We don't stand up for justice only against our enemies when they're doing something wrong. The verse explicitly says when it's from your own community, your own family, and it also demands of Muslims to be not just opposed to injustice, but torchbearers, leaders on a global stage for justice. That's the moral obligation that I think Muslims should be inspired by. And it's also a call for rejecting the politics of, tribalism, or what I call in the philosophy of the term is situational ethics, where you have a certain ethical standard based on the situation in question. You don't believe in universal ethics. That's not my understanding of Islam.
This is the last question. And then, the role of the Muslims today. What needs to happen, Sheikh? I mean, we didn't talk a lot regarding the region. Inshallah, we need to come back to actually discuss what the position of Iran today, nuclear weapons, and what Iran needs to do to protect itself and all of that. But do you see let's say, look, the stand that Iran has taken, it has made United States look vulnerable. That U.S. is no longer able to bully everyone into whatever it is that it wants to achieve in the region. Now there's China, there's Russia. I'm sure the rest of the global South is looking at this situation and saying that, America is not what it's made out to be, and others. So what do you see in the coming future, Sheikh, as far as the role of America and Muslims in general post-Iranian, conflict?
Yeah. Well, look, I think one thing that we can say for sure, and it's clearly, it's clear to anyone who's watching global politics today that the United States is a declining global power and China is a rising power. Just in terms of, what's happening domestically in the United States, I think the rise of Donald Trump, the fact that he got elected twice, given his politics and given what he represents and given these wars.
You mean internal chaos also?
Internal chaos. The internal chaos, which is actually really fundamentally a function of the expansion of economic injustice in the United States, the absence of the middle class, the growing influence of private interest groups, the shrinking of, the inability just for people to pay their bills. I mean, the statistic that I like to cite is that, at least 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. They have no savings. It wasn't like that 40 years ago. So the internal politics and injustice in the United States produces leaders like Donald Trump who accelerate the decline of America's global standing. China is rising, but I would argue very strongly that anyone who thinks that a Chinese-dominated world would be a better world than the American-led regional order is deeply misguided. The model of internal Chinese behavior, specifically with respect to Muslims. Let's not forget what's happening to our Uyghur brothers and sisters in Xinjiang. Just count the number of mosques that have been destroyed in Xinjiang in the attempt to eradicate that Muslim identity. So a Chinese-led world order is not, I think, a replacement. And I don't think, as Muslims who have an ethical consciousness and awareness, that we should, be forced to pick and choose that it's either the United States and Europe or it's China or Russia. Take your pick. No, I think we need to stand for an alternative way, an alternative way, one that's much more deeply, that's fundamentally rooted in Islamic ethics, that has sort of one standard for everyone and that fights for, basic rights and opportunities for everyone around the world. Based on a set of rules that we all can agree with. So I think the world is changing very rapidly. I think the American empire is, accelerating its decline. I think we're entering a moment of chaos and uncertainty. What happened in Iran could happen to other Muslim countries again. They could be attacked. I think the genocide in Gaza is certainly ongoing, but it's at a lower level. It could reunite again. I think everything I'm reading from Israel today, Israel wants to complete its ethnic cleansing of Gaza, so it's not going to go away.
I mean, you're talking 70% is already in their hands.
Yeah. And across, if you look at across the at least Arab, the Middle East and North Africa, the parts of the world that I study more closely, if you look at the basic socioeconomic data, mass poverty and pauperization, rising unemployment, growing political repression, and on top of all of these existing problems, we have this new element that's adding to chaos and uncertainty and oppression, global economic disaster. You know, the Middle East is disproportionately affected by climate change. Large parts of the Middle East will no longer be inhabitable. So we're headed to a period of deep uncertainty. And the question for Muslims is, how should we respond to these many challenges? What is our ethical obligation in this moment of chaos and uncertainty? I mean, this is a question we all should be talking about. We all should be debating. Imams should be giving sermons about this. But unfortunately, I think these are the things that we should be talking about.
No,
and that's why I'm happy to be on your program.
Jazakallah khair, and thank you for coming on the program. And inshallah, this will be one of many times that we're going to invite you, because there's a lot more that we need to discuss.
One of the things that I love about being Muslim is that we are rooted in community. We have to come together. The more we come together to discuss, to debate, to understand the world we're living in, the better I've written about, and I say to my students that these are the dark days of Muslim history. I've never seen it this bad. You know? And so the only way we're going to figure a way out of this darkness is by having these types of conversations, coming to conferences, discussing, debating, and arguing among ourselves, of course, civilly, within the framework of, Islamic ethics, to figure out the way forward. And so I appreciate the opportunity of doing so today on your program, and hope we can do it again, inshallah, soon.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykhi.
Okay, shukran jazilan.
Yeah.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. Take care.
Salam. You too.